And now, on with the show. Our first speaker, our keynote speaker today is Ms. Katie Cunningham. She's formerly of NASA, where she discovered Django, was involved in using Django at NASA. She is now with the Cox Media Group, and is also an author with books printed by both O'Reilly and the Pearson Press, and I think she's got a couple others in the works coming down the pipeline. She is here today to talk about that experience of being an author and the experience of getting documentation out there. Django has always had a very strong tradition of having good documentation, but that doesn't mean we can't improve and we can't have more of it. So, without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage the real Katie Cunningham.
Okay. Hi, I'm here to talk to you about how to learn to love writing, or how Harry Potter fanfic will improve your documentation. So who am I? As Russ said, my name is Katie Cunningham. I'm a Python and Django developer for Cox Media Group in the United States. I've also written 2 books for O'Reilly and Pearson. Because these 2 didn't completely break my spirit, I'm working on my 3rd book, one that focuses on kids and the people who teach them. Even before I wrote those books, I was churning out quite a bit of tech writing. When I worked at NASA, I was called the documentation fairy, because one of my tasks was to take whatever our group was working on at the moment and generate enough documentation to make the government happy. I got quite a bit of practice at NASA because they really liked documentation. They wanted it by the pound. Before that, though, I wrote fiction. Now, I never published anything. I never even sent out so much as a proposal. But it was something that entertained me, and it forced my brain to stretch into new directions. Now, in my day-to-day work, I spend quite a bit of time reading various things the tech community produces. I read docs for modules that I need to use. I read technical books on the languages that I want to learn. I read blog posts in hopes of solving a problem that I have. I go to Stack Overflow and try to figure out issues that we're having with our local environment. With all this reading, I've realized something. People, we really need to get better at writing. So why bother being good at writing? We're not writers, we're coders. I've met more than a few developers who insist that being able to write well isn't important to their career. I mean, it's a waste of time, isn't it? They could just be spending all that time coding. Isn't that a better use of all those valuable minutes they would lose writing stuff? Well, you can use the same excuse when it comes to regular bathing. I mean, why waste all that time standing under a shower and dealing with soap and shampoo and washing your clothes and doing that? You could spend all that time coding. I mean, think about how much more you would have at the end of the week. You would have hours you would have saved. I think we can all agree that giving up hygiene does not make the world a better place, no matter how much code you generate. Well, the same applies to writing. If you want your projects to survive longer than your attention span, you'd better document them. In spite of what someone once told you, elegant code is not all the documentation you need. I'm actually kind of confused by people who talk about this. I have this image of them sitting in front of a roaring fire reading code, with a snifter of brandy or something. This one is from the RNK era. It sends the memory management sends shivers down my spine. But here's a reality check. None of us like you that much. We want a too long didn't read, and that is a big part of what documentation is. We don't want to have to read your code to figure out what the heck it does and how to use it. When you write poorly, you communicate poorly. Ever had a ticket where the requirements were just so unclear you got headaches looking at it? You spend days and maybe even weeks going back and forth to the owner of the ticket, trying to figure out what the heck they actually want. And they rewrite it, and it doesn't make sense. And, you ask any questions, and they rewrite it again. It doesn't even answer your questions. And finally, when you get out of them what the meat of the problem is, you think, well, why the heck didn't you say that in the first place? If you don't practice saying things clearly, you won't be able to say things clearly when it matters. So, sorry, my vocal's catching up. What are the reasons that you're going to want to be able to write well is that at some point you're going to want to have to sell something you have. Unless you were gifted with a vast amount of money at birth, chances are at some point you're going to need to convince somebody else to give you cash. You might have an idea you want to sell. Ever had somebody try to they try to tell you about this awesome idea they have, and they go on and on forever, and then you're just kind of like, I have no idea where you're coming from. And you think maybe they're kind of a little bit crazy. Chances are they're not crazy. They just don't have practice communicating clearly. If you're not an idea person, you probably still have to sell something that you have. Maybe it's something that you make, like your company actually makes some kind of API you want other people to consume, and you've been sent to a conference to try to convince people to use it. Maybe you've gone to a conference to try to convince people to work for your company. You may even just have an app that's super convenient for you, but it's not going to be convenient to all your friends use it, so you have to convince them to use it. Well, I've lost count of the number of times somebody has tried to sell me on an app like Bump, when Bump was a thing, and they're like, it's great, and they go all over it, and I'm just like, why are you so excited about this stupid app? Well, they can't communicate clearly why they're so excited. They can just show me with gesticulation that they're super excited. Even if you have no products and no ideas, one day you have to sell yourself. Trust me, resume writing is a whole lot easier once you've written some fiction, because it's basically like fanfic about yourself. So if writing helps us out so much, why aren't we doing it more? Why do we still suck at it? Now, I won't lie, writing takes time. The first time I wrote something long form, I would sit down and I would write and write and write and write. The sun would move across the sky and the shadows would move across the floor, and I would just keep writing. And then I would save and I'd do a word count, and I'd have 250 words. And I would scream at my word processor because I swore I'd written at least 5,000 words. But it takes so much time that sometimes it can feel like this is a complete waste of my time because I've gotten nowhere. It's also kind of boring when you're starting off. When you're writing technical stuff, there's a good chance you're not going to have a ton of fun. I mean, I do this for real money. People give me money to do technical documentation and to write books and stuff. And I'm not sitting there giggling and laughing and totally joyous the entire time. I mean, if I did, my family would probably worry about me more. It's also very frustrating. Have you ever had the angst of looking at a blank page or a blank email, knowing you have to write something? It's important. You have to write a thing, but you have no idea what to actually write, and nothing comes to you. I've got empty bottles of bourbon that show how much I know that pain. And what about writing something where you think you're totally clear? You write an email and you're cool, everybody will understand this. And this sudden war breaks out because nobody understood what you were talking about. And you keep trying to fix it, no, I meant. And they're well, that word doesn't mean that. And you just have this horrible, you want to crawl under your desk and die. Because everybody seems to be reading something different from what you actually wrote. It's probably not their comprehension. It's probably your writing. Sorry. So what does something like fan fiction have to do with writing as a developer? Well, everything. For those that don't know, fanfic, which is short for fan fiction, is a story that's written by a fan of a certain show or movie or book or game or whatever, some kind of media. They use the universe and the characters of the original authors, but play out original stories, possibly even creating new characters. So a fanfic author might insert themselves into the Harry Potter universe, or write a story from the perspective of the treants in Lord of the Rings. I personally would love a story about what happened to the Entwives. Sorry about all the text. I just thought this was really funny. You can read it later. I'll have the slides up. So again, why bother? Writing stuff like fanfic is generally fun, low risk, and it will help you get writing, and it will help you at writing in your day job. I mean, I know, you could spend hours and hours writing technical stuff like blogs and documentation and proposals and copy for your website. If that kind of thing gets your juices flowing, don't let me stop you. I mean, some people love writing that kind of stuff. But if you don't, and you still need practice writing, then this is a really great way to get started. It's really low risk. Your career is not riding on it. Nobody even ever has to see it. And it's just something fun to do for yourself. So you might as well do something fun, because if you wait until you have to write something professionally and your career is on the line, you cannot just throw words up on the screen and hope that they'll make sense, because they won't. Just like you need to practice coding, you need to practice writing. So what are the tools of the author? Because one of the great things about learning to write, like writing fanfic and silly stuff like this, the tools you use here as a fanfic author are the same tools you use as a technical writer. So what are some of these tools? Well, it's not just a laptop and a lot of coffee. The first thing is speed. An experienced author writes faster. And I'm not talking about how fast their fingers move across the keyboard. I've been writing for many years now, and I don't think that my words per minute has increased significantly since college. What has changed is how many of those words are good words. The first time I wrote something long form, I ended up throwing out literally half the book, like 25,000 words that I had spent days, weeks even, cranking on and, crying over and figuring out, and I threw them away. And that wasn't even the end of it. I tossed out whole scenes, I tossed out whole plots, characters. I completely stripped the story down to it was practically just a short story at that point. But that's the life of the beginning writer. I didn't have the habit of picking the right words from the get-go. I was inexperienced, so I spent too long on scenes that weren't going anywhere. I added in characters because I didn't know what to do. It just, I had a lot of bad habits that over time I got, rid of because I got really tired of throwing out half the book. Over time, I did find that I was cutting out less. Sure, I might move something around or color dialogue or remove a scene, but I wasn't deleting half the book. In technical writing, if you have practice writing higher quality text, then you end up spending less time reading over your docs and yanking out the weak sections. You're also able to see what the weak sections are. You won't waste time writing and rewriting a very important email. You won't waste your coworkers' time pulling them over and saying, oh my God, can you read this before I send it, because I have absolutely no confidence in my ability to put one word after the other. The ability to pick the right words transfers really well between mediums. Check out the nonfiction books put out by fiction authors. Stephen King's On Writing is considered a classic amongst many writers. King did not spend years relearning how to write nonfiction since he'd been writing fiction all this time. He already knew how to be coherent. This actually surprised me when it happened to me. The first time I was asked to create technical documentation at NASA, I was terrified. I'm like, I am completely out of my depth. I have done nothing but write stupid backstories for my D&D characters, and this is not my bag. But it was kind of amazing. I was actually faster than most of the people who it was their full-time job to do this. And this was just a task they put me on because there was no money in the bucket to get one of them. I had the fewest corrections, and I actually had the happiest customers. They actually read my documentation, which is a huge compliment, because normally at NASA they just weigh it. And if it's heavy enough, then you get to deploy your website. Another tool is organization. When you write, you have to be organized. Some writers are externally organized, writing huge outlines and creating character summaries for everyone in their story. I mean, hell, summaries. I know people who create dossiers, like FBI dossiers. You have an FBI kind of thing here, don't you? Oh, okay, you know who it is. Dana Scully. They have like dossiers on each of their characters, like who their best friend was and where they went to school and all their heartbreaks and when they stole candy from a store when they were 8, that kind of stuff. And they'll pore over material that exists for the world, and they'll take notes about when they can use something, when they can stick their story, and what they can reference. When I was writing Amber fanfic, I don't know if anybody knows Amber by Roger Zelazny, my original characters had like huge dossiers. I not only knew who like their parents were, I knew how they were raised, what their hobbies were, who their first love was, the major heartbreaks and victories of youth, that kind of stuff. And I may have even like created a database for this kind of thing, like with a really nice API and a web interface. I'm a nerd, so anyway, writers are crazy organized. Even those that do something called discovery writing, where they just kind of sit down and start writing, have internal organization. If you talk to ones that do this, they actually have like everything in their head. They just haven't written down the outline. So that's what's happening, is they've pre-organized in their head and they're able to just write. And they keep track of where things are and they can move things around. They don't throw away half their book. So what does this have to do with technical writing? Well, learning to outline well makes your life so much easier. Whenever I start a new technical document, whether it's a bit of docs for a new project or a book, I start with an outline. It's something we all learned when we were kids, and we just kind of grew up and decided we didn't need it anymore. Well, it's one of those tools you should have kept, that you should remember how to outline things. I mean, first of all, it takes pressure off your brain when you're writing. If you're not sure what to write next, you just pull up your outline. You're like, okay, well, I guess I'm writing that next. And you just start writing it. If you don't feel like writing that thing right now, you're like, what's something else I feel like writing? I'll write that thing. And you write that thing instead. You can also look forward and say, okay, when do I need to cover this thing? Okay, I haven't covered this. It's covered later, so I need to not talk about that. Second, it helps you avoid issues down the line. When I was writing Python in 24 hours, my editor had me write up this outline, and she handed it over to another author. He pointed out major issues, and we were able to fix it with no effort. I hadn't written the book at this point. Had I written the book, it would have been a completely rewrite of the first third of the book. But because of that, all it was swapping a couple of bits around and him saying, yeah, that looks much better. And it saved me probably months of effort. Now, outside of outlining, organizing your information and research is incredibly important when you do technical writing. When I'm starting out a new book, I keep an organized list of resources for the things that I'm not an expert on. 24 Hours had a chapter on Flask, which at the time I hadn't really used, but I knew it was something that I could cover in an hour. So I had a bunch of resources that I would go back to and double-check and cross-check to make sure that I was doing something correctly and in a Flasky way. Clarity is another skill that comes only with practice. None of us are born with it. If you don't believe me, listen to a 4-year-old try to tell a story of what happened at a movie, and you're going to have an aneurysm because it's going to make no sense. We are not born being clear. Even every beginning writer has a story in their arsenal where they just kind of gallop through the story. I mean, they want to get to the exciting parts. So who wants to talk about boring stuff like setting and motivation and backstory? Let's just get to the juicy bits. This happens quite a bit if the story happens to have sex in it. Anyway, the story suffers because you're moving too fast and just focusing on the stuff that's fun to write. This costs you clarity. No one is quite sure why they're watching Snape kiss Ron. It's confusing and off-putting because you didn't take the time to set the scene. Experienced writers know you have to build up to the juicy bits. You actually learn to like it. You spend time crafting scenes that will help put the reader in the right state of mind so they can fully anticipate the carnal buffet you're about to lay before them. Am I going to get a call from Code of Conduct? Sorry. So there's not any sex scenes in docs usually. However, there are juicy bits. Most of us rush to the end goal when trying to explain something. Just like run pip install and bam, you're done. And that's like, I've actually run across documentation. They're just like pip install and you're good. I don't need to explain anything more. We leave out things like examples. We avoid caveats. We also avoid any system we're not intimately familiar with, people who never touch anything besides like Ubuntu or Mac. We just want to talk about the cool things that our module can do. When I read other people's docs, I often joke they leave out steps 1, 3, 5, and 8. They'll skip out like vital setup instructions because everyone knows how to do that, right? They'll leave out system requirements because it should be obvious, according to them. They leave out steps that, have become second nature to them, so they don't really think about them. Or fail to mention that, yeah, they've only tested this against Python 2.6, so maybe this won't work under Python 2.7. An experienced writer knows to slow down. They're practiced in it. They've learned to take a breath and read over what they've written. In fact, the more experienced a writer is, the more they actually can keep what they've written inside their head. So it's kind of like the book is live in the back of your head, so you know, like the past several pages, what you've talked about, so you can keep a thread going. Perspective is another thing that comes up in writing. With stories, perspective is vital. Let's say someone is writing a fanfic about a typical day on board Starship Enterprise. Who we follow and how we follow them changes the story drastically. We could follow a nameless redshirt as he observes the captain and his crew and their interactions. We might be deep inside of his head while he's thinking about how Kirk is actually kind of a jerk and Spock would be so much better a captain. We might just observe his actions and slowly realize that he's setting up some kind of sabotage event. We might take the perspective of Kirk as he watches this new red shirt make his rounds, or of Spock as he realizes that something is not quite right with this dude. We might have all of these perspectives, actually, carefully arranged to best ramp up tension. Novice writers freak out about perspective because you need to know what perspective you're using before you even start writing. They usually just think of it as a choice between first person and third. So I went and opened the door, or Jim went and opened the door. It's really much more subtle than that. Experienced writers know that perspective is a way to manipulate the reader into feeling and knowing exactly what you want when you want it for the biggest impact. Agatha Christie is an expert at this, making sure you only find out vital information when it will have its fullest impact on you. She does this by tightly controlling whose perspective she is showing off at any one time. And Then There Were One is a really good example of this, if you ever want a case study in perspective. In technical writing, you have to consider perspective as well. Rather than revealing bombs and murder weapons, though, you're revealing information. When you consider perspective in technical writing, you have to think of your audience constantly. What do they know coming into this? Are they novices? Are you okay with assuming they're not a novice? Do they already have certain things set up that you are positive of? Is it internal to the company that you need to point off other things? Are they a new person who knows where none of this stuff is? Do they even know Python? Do they know how to set up a server? Do they know how to properly add an app to Django? That kind of stuff. So that is how you need to consider where they're coming from. And as you write, you have to keep checking yourself. You really want to create an example that shows off one part of your module, but have you explained it yet? You're using an Nginx setup. Have you made that clear? Have you made it clear you're not using Apache and this doesn't work with Apache, or you have no intention of testing it with Apache? Are you tossing too much information at the user at once, which is actually where a lot of documentation fails? It just throws too much. Or the other mistake it makes is it doesn't call to attention things that are important by isolating them. By saying, making sure it's one sentence and you're like, hey, this is important, does not work in Python 2.6 because there's a lot of people still running on Python 2.6. So what are some of the resources? Most adults who get into writing don't just dive in right away. I mean, most adults who decide they want to do anything don't start. It's only kids that do that. Kids are like, I'm going to be a fireman. I'm going to get a hose and start a fire and figure that out. Most adults are like, oh, I really want to get into woodworking. Yeah, I'm going to read Wikipedia for the next 3 years and figure all that out. Because if there's anything that adults are really good at, it's procrastinating. And also, writers are expert procrastinators. So we have lots of places for you to go for help. Even if you decide that you don't want to write anything but emails and text docs and blog posts and proposals and all that kind of stuff, that doesn't mean you can't take advantage of some of the stuff that's been put out there for writers. There are actually a couple of really good podcasts you can listen to. Writing Excuses is one of my favorite podcasts. It is geared toward genre writers, but they have a lot of useful things for anyone. I actually use a lot of their tips in my technical writing. First, they're just fun to listen to. They have a very nice, bantery kind of group. Second, as they say, they're only 15 minutes long, so you're not sitting there for an hour, getting really bored after the first 20 minutes. And they do get to the point, and they always have useful takeaways. Most importantly, they talk about things like structure and organization and writing setup and writer's block, which you can still get with technical writing. Oh, trust me. These are things that affect tech writers and fiction writers alike. I'd Rather Be Writing is actually a technical podcast, a tech writing podcast. It's not as fun as the one where they're talking about dragons and magic systems and stuff, but it's still very good. They cover things like documenting APIs, styles for including code samples, how to write examples, pacing, that kind of stuff. And they also cover stuff like blogging. I highly recommend giving their beginner tips on their website a good read, even if you don't really consider yourself a beginner. There's also no shortage of books telling you how to write. One of the favorite acts of procrastination that we writers have is reading yet another book on how to write. I think I read 10 different books before I finally sat down and said, I actually have to write something now. Because it does not make you a writer to read books about writing. It just makes you well-read. I recommend reading one or two, just don't try to read all of them. And I'm only going to give you a couple examples here. This is one of my favorite ones, Fiction First Aid. It's a little hard to find sometimes, but you can track it down. I love it because it shows bad samples of writing, and you actually start reading it and think, God, I'm not that bad. So there's hope for me. But it shows bad samples of writing, but also goes back and shows the advice that this, he's actually a teacher, gave the student and how the student fixed it, it's great because you can see how bad turns to good, and how to fix common mistakes and common issues you have, like word choice, pacing, different perspective, that kind of stuff. And I think that it just drives a lot of the lessons that we're told constantly home a bit better. There's also the Write Great Fiction series, which has a book for pretty much anything you'd ever need to cover, from plot to setting to dialogue to editing. It has a book on everything. So beyond reading books about writing, though, it's very important to just read. I think that many people need to read more, and not just read blog posts, not just read your RSS feeds, not just read magazines, read long form. Because long form is where you get a lot of these, understanding the craft. And especially blog posts are not often professionally produced. And you don't even need to read literary fiction. Read that if you want to read that and that's your thing. But you can learn a lot just reading genre fiction. I learned everything. I learned so much just reading Agatha Christie and understanding perspective. If you want to read about space wizards and paranormal detectives and over-the-top stuff, that's good. It'll get your mind going. MIT also has a free writing workshop that you can take online. The readings are really light. I've actually read them all before, and they're not heavy. It's MIT, but these are really, these are high school level readings. You can get through them. And the assignments are, some of them are personal essays, nonfiction writing, and some microfiction. Also, the great thing is, since you're not actually turning any of this into MIT, you can go ahead and write that slash fic that you've been wanting to do. Another really important resource if you want to write is other people. They can help you grow as a writer because they can call you out when you're being lazy or self-indulgent. When you're like, I don't need to explain that. That's fine. The reader will figure out, and they'll love the fact they figured it out. No, they don't. There's very rare cases where readers like figuring stuff out. like mystery novels. But for the most part, readers do want information. They don't want to feel uncertain. Many areas have writers groups. You can check to see if anybody's hosting one on a regular basis. You can go to coffee shops, bookstores, that kind of stuff. Google also helps in this regard, but I will warn you, for some reason, like, writers groups are super bad about creating a web presence. I don't know. Apparently, they need us as much as we need them. If you can't find any in the real world, there's also a bunch of ones that you can join online. You just need to make sure that they actually are writing something you want to read. Don't join a historical fiction group if you want to actually read science fiction and write that. You can also find ones that do technical writing, although those are a bit rare and usually very focused. A lot of Java ones for some reason, and they don't like us. Never met Java people who actually like Python people. Another thing you can do is at your company. Talk to the people at your company and say maybe every other week we can get together and we can write technical docs and review them with each other. In an open environment, friendly environment, go over all the stuff. Because I can't think of any company that thinks I wish our stack was just a little less well documented. And what we have is so clear. It's horrible. This is an advantage for your company to actually have well-written documentation. Trust me, I'm from a company where we're suffering from that. It's costing us money to onboard people because one person has to literally quit their job for a week to onboard people because we have no documentation. Sorry, boss. But it's true. It costs us a lot of money. It would have saved us a lot of money if we had really simple onboarding docs. So that's all I have today. I spoke quickly, but happily we're running late, so that works out. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, I have the mic.
I'll run it down. All right, so if you have a question, there we go.
So I'd be interested in knowing how you put this talk together and what kind of techniques you use from writing preparation that work well for talk preparation as well.
I actually have kind of a weird method. I'll put down a few ideas and then I'll talk to myself for a few weeks. Happily, I work from home, so it's just me and my dog during the day. So I walk around and talk and pace and record myself, and the dog just kind of sits in his bed and looks at me like I'm nuts. But most of it is verbal. But as I come up with good ideas, I write it down and I create an outline. And slowly, and actually at some point I created the outline and then started filling in all the chunks of text that I wanted to put in and all the things I wanted to hit. It's a very iterative thing that I go over several weeks, back and forth. And then I'm like, oh shit, I need to create slides.
Hi. Have you ever done NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, and do you think it's a good thing to do?
It's so good. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I forgot it. I had a note to myself to add it, and I was like, oh, damn it. Yes, NaNoWriMo is great. Let me explain what NaNoWriMo is. NaNoWriMo is a thing where basically during the month of November, you write a book. You write a 50,000-word book, which is really a novella, but if you can get 50,000 words out, it's great. You start on November 1st. You cannot write anything before that. You start on November 1st, and you write until the 30th. That's 1,667 words per day you need to write. You need to up it to 2,000. If you're American, you want to take Thanksgiving off, or if you need to do anything during November. I don't know what you'll have in November. But it's a great thing. You can join groups where you read each other's stuff. It's basically a way to get a lot of crap out of your system because, remember, writing is practice. And even though I've done NaNoWriMo 4 or 5 years, and the first time I did it, it was so bad. It was so horrible. The next year was okay, but every year I got better. And even though I never did anything with those novels but put them in a folder that I password protected from anybody, that it's okay, I was learning tricks and I was actually getting better and the stories were more coherent. So I do love NaNoWriMo, and I do participate.
How general do you think people should pitch, say if you're writing any kind of technical documentation, if you to generalize on a target audience, do you think is there a certain age at which you should try and...
I recommend everybody write technical documentation at 12-year-olds, which everyone's like, but you have to understand, when we talk about grade level in like the US, we talk about a 6th grade level. That is only because if you have an adult reading that, they can read it very quickly, and they get information very quickly, because the point is not to use big fancy words to show like how smart you are and like your Word-a-day calendar was so totally worth it. The point is to get information into the person's head. And if you're talking to an adult at that level, that gets information in really quickly, which is, by the way, what most newspapers are written at a 6th grade level. Do you call it 6th grade? It's the, yeah. So, but newspapers are at that level for a reason. They want you to consume the information quickly, not go, crap, what is that word? You know, because there is more important things than that cool word or long sentence structure or, complex, complex structure of like how you would create the story.
So if you get to the mic, so it's for the video.
Do you have any recommendations on resources for learning about layout? Because I just find it's important, but it's hard to find good resources for that.
Layout, like laying out a book?
Just laying out on a, like if, for example, if you go through the head first manuals, they're really heavy on their images and very low level, but I mean, it's hard to find where
I pay people to do that. I'll be honest. Well, actually, they're like, no, you're a writer. We've seen what you tried to do with Word. No, whenever I write a book, a layout person actually does it. So it's not something I'm experienced in. I'm always amazed when they come back and I'm like, holy crap, it looks like a book. And they're like, well, yeah, it's our job, That, and I don't know. And I don't know of any of them that blog either, because I know several people that do it, but I don't think they really have like a presence in the community. Your best bet might be looking for something in graphic design, because that's where a lot of those people come from. That's their school. Yes?
Probably not allowed. Answer to this question, The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst has a good section on page layouts, how much you want in your margins, that kind of thing. It's got some really interesting examples, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gutenberg Bible, Oxford English Dictionary. Fantastic book, really, really interesting.
There you go. That's why you need other people when you write, because they know more than you. But I never do layouts, so I don't know.
Okay, my question, what tools do you use to write when you actually type it in?
These days, I am writing in ASCII doc, which is a version of RST, restructured text, that is, it's actually nice, but you can just use restructured text. The reason I use ASCII doc is because the company I'm writing for, O'Reilly, they have a new system called Atlas, where you can just use, like, write an ASCII doc, push it up to their server, and then they'll build it automatically. So that's why I'm using that. On my own, I prefer things like RST, ASCII doc, whatever is available. If you're working with a publisher, use their tool. I learned this the hard way. I tried to use my own tool, like, I'm going to use DocBook, because it was like, yeah, this would be great. I'm going to use it. Everybody uses this. And the conversion was painful between the two. So if you actually want to write a book, the first question to your publisher should be, yeah, so like what do you write in? And they'll give you a bunch of options. You may be forced to work in Word, but often it's worth it to kind of go through that pain, to not go through the pain later, because it took me 3 months to convert a bunch of stuff that I had written, and it hurt.
You mean converting from ASCII doc to Word or from Word to ASCII?
No, that was from DocBook to Word, because it didn't they wanted their template, and it was munging up their system, and they weren't going to pay somebody to go and fix my stuff, so I had to go and fix it myself. So
I like ASCII doc. Good choice.
yeah. Any other questions? Oh,
It sounds like a silly question, but how do you know how deep to go? How do you know when to stop and to fill out something else?
I tend to be a skimming author. When I write, I will write like the first level, and then I will start like diving down a little bit deeper. I'll go back and I'll rewrite and I'll dive down a little bit deeper. Generally, I look at how long I've been talking about something because I'll actually render it to pages, like actual physical pages. And the reason I do this is because 250 words per page is meaningful to the human brain. That's how much information they're taking in. If I've been talking about like string functions for 10 pages and like how strings work, we have gone way too deep on strings. I don't need to go any deeper. I need to break this down, take a break, let the person like ingest some information for a while, because I have a feeling they're just going to start skimming after a few pages. And after you've written a bunch, you start to get a feel for that, because you do start to take on the mind of the reader as you read something. One thing I recommend doing is reading aloud. Like, write out what you've written and walk around and read it. You will hear where it is awkward. When you're going, bleh, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that is awkward, because when it's awkward in your mouth, it's awkward on the page. But we forgive ourselves when we're not forced to do that, to actually read it out aloud. Or you could have it read to you if you know how to use screen readers or any kind of like Mac Speak kind of thing. Have it read to you and you will hear the awkward bits all of a sudden. But when you start reading it and you're like, oh, I've been talking about these stupid, like strings or this Django function for like an hour, I'm done. You've probably gone too deep.
Okay, so you've addressed the authoring side of things. The writing huge volumes of stuff is great, but unless you're actually getting the feedback on why you suck, it's difficult to get the improvement. I mean, obviously you can self-edit and self-audit and you improve through usage, but how do you find good editing resources, especially when it comes to technical stuff? The fiction stuff is not so hard because some people do actually want to read incredibly bad fan fiction and are willing to put up with a lot, but not many people are willing to put up with bad technical documentation for amusement value.
I find liquor works.
Liquor, okay.
You also make friends with other people who do technical writing. I'm friends with a lot of other authors. And because I'm friends with them, they will get chapters that I'm like, help, this sucks. Please unsuck it. And they will read it and they'll be like, it only sucks a little bit, honey. It's okay. And they'll make suggestions. So you do get these friendships as you go along that you build relationships. You also build relationships with people who know your style. Has anybody here read the Python Standard Library by Example by Doug Hellman? It's good. You should all read it. Doug and I have a relationship. He's tech read my stuff. I've tech read his stuff. We will send each other stuff and go like, okay, this makes sense. This is okay. You're just doubting yourself. Don't doubt yourself. This is okay. It's fine. So you do. I mean, and you can develop those relationships at work. If you have somebody who's invested in also having good documentation, you can start courting them to be your friend. Any other questions?
Do we have any other questions? No? Yeah, well, if that's the case, I would like to thank Katie very, very much for being our keynote speaker today. Thank you very much, Katie Cunningham.